Hello and good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you for joining the first session of EPRI's Earth Week 6-part series, highlighting R&D accelerating a clean energy transition. Our first session today is Pathways to Decarbonization. I'm joined by Neil Wilmshurst, Senior Vice President of Energy System Resources, and Rob Chapman, Senior Vice President of Energy Delivery and Customer Solutions. This week, we'll have a number of sessions from both of your teams on topics from nuclear's role in a clean energy future, to EPRI's low-carbon resource initiative, to electrification. Today, we're going to be discussing decarbonization, resiliency, and electrification. So let's go ahead and get started. Rob, how does electrification of particular sectors, such as transportation and buildings, play a role in broader decarbonization?
Great. Thank you, Samantha. And good morning from California to Neil and Samantha and to all of our participants today. Happy Earth Week to everyone. Great question, Samantha, in terms of decarbonization. Let me just ground everyone by saying really the ultimate prize for us is around decarbonization of the entire economy, not just the electricity sector, which is where we hear quite a bit of interest in reducing our carbon footprint. When I think about decarbonization of the entire economy, I take one stat into note. That is that 75% of the final energy used in the U.S. is actually associated with fossil fuels. So when I look at transportation, when I look at space and water heating, and I look at industry, 75% of that energy comes from fossil fuels. So it's not only about what we can do in the energy sector to decarbonize our footprint, but it's really about then what we do to enable decarbonization of the entire economy going forward. And just to give you a couple examples there, on the transportation side, the carbon footprint of transportation is actually greater than the carbon footprint of the electricity sector. Very important to note that we're making great strides in terms of decarbonizing the electric supply. Now what we can do is take this cleaner fuel that we're producing and work with the other sectors of our economy, whether it be transportation, whether it be buildings, space and water heating, or industry, and where it makes sense to work on decarbonization of those industries also. Now, I will note that one of the things that we realize is as we decarbonize other sectors of the economy, one of the things that we have to keep in mind is the fact that a resilient, reliable, and affordable level of power is required for all going forward. In fact, what we are thinking is if electricity today is about 20% of final energy, over the next 30 or so years, we expect that to increase nearly threefold to about 60% of final energy, meaning much more end-use sources, whether it be your electric vehicle, whether it be a heat pump, or whether it be industry production tools will be electrified. And as an industry, what we need to make sure is that we're not only providing that cleaner fuel, but we're also making sure that it's a much more reliable, resilient, and maintains the affordability aspect to support this transition that we're undergoing. So very important that we think about this very broadly in terms of not only what we're doing as the electricity sector, but keep in mind what that ultimate prize is. It's decarbonization of the entire economy going forward.
Yeah, so Rob, what kind of technologies do you think we need to focus on to get there?
Yeah, I think we have the first one coming out of the chutes, and electric transportation is a very beginning to become much more progressive in terms of where it's at in terms of the adoption. And we'll discuss that probably a little further going forward. I think when you look at other areas on the buildings, space and water heating are going to be critical. Advanced heat pumps for space heating are going to make sure that from an industry that we are not only able to provide this in warmer climates such as California or the South, but also in cooler climates to make sure that those areas could also take advantage of this very efficient technology, the advanced heat pumps. I think when you look on industry, it's going to be a little bit more challenging to do. And one of the things that we emphasize from an EPRI perspective is we are not advocating electrification at all costs. Where electrification makes sense from an affordability perspective, where it makes sense to support that particular part of our economy, whether it be transport, buildings, or industry, we are advocating that transition. Now, the flip of that is we recognize the importance of low carbon resources also. And ultimately, whether it's hydrogen, ammonia, or other low carbon carriers, how important they're going to be in order to decarbonize the entire economy. So it's not electrification at all costs. Neil, I know that that's something, the Low Carbon Resources Initiative, something you're very interested in and leading the way in. But bottom line, it's to make sure that we think about this from an affordability perspective, a resiliency perspective, and a reliability perspective, with decarbonization being the ultimate goal. Many different pathways to get there. Electrification is one of them.
Yeah.
So speaking of energy resources, Neil, how critical is the integration of all generation sources in global decarbonization?
Okay, so great question and welcome to everyone. So glad to be here. The integration of resources, Rob teed it up very well. That there's a long way to go decarbonizing. The industry, electric industry's come a long way over the last 20 or 30 years. But if we're going to get to a mid-century net zero, there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done. And it's possible to get there with limited resources, but it's going to be way easier to get there with integration of diverse technologies and bringing along technologies we already have in place. So integrating those technologies in a reliable and resilient way is going to be really important. And that is the challenge we face, how to keep what we have and add new technologies to move together to that 2050 mid-century position. And not every solution is the same for every location. As you look across the globe, there'll be different solutions for different scenarios, different technologies, and they all need to fit together to get to that ultimate goal.
Yeah, Neil, you really hit on a key point, which is the regional nuances. And Neil mentioned just globally the differences between all of our, when you think globally about how decarbonization is going to work, there are different pathways depending upon where you're at. And when you look at the U.S. in general, the U.S., even region by region, has different pathways that need to recognize the nuances of whether or not you're a high producer of renewable energy or whether or not you have to depend upon other sources. But Neil hit a key theme that I think is so important to highlight and focus on for folks. It's technology optionality. At the end of the day, technology optionality in order to support not only the affordability aspect, but also then to support the resilience and reliability aspect is going to be increasingly important going forward. We know no matter what industry you're in, the more technology options that they have, the greater that you're able to manage risk going forward. And there is a lot of risk in this transition that we are going through as an industry. So recognizing that technology optionality from a supply side of the perspective is going to be very important. And really, from an EPRI perspective, we think very broadly in terms of all of these technologies and the impact that they have and how to see the role that they play and then how to evaluate that by a regional perspective is going to be increasingly important going forward. And I know that, Neil, one of the areas, of course, that you're very focused in on is the advanced nuclear area. And I don't know if you want to say any words about where advanced nuclear is from a U.S. perspective versus an international perspective, but any insights into how that technology is evolving?
Well, Rob, you're building on that whole question about how do we get to 2050 using the resources we have. A big aspect to think about is make sure we get to a destination with a plan for how we sustain that beyond arriving at that destination. The current nuclear fleet are a really substantial portion of the zero carbon generation portfolio. But if that generation fleet doesn't get extended or shuts down, what actual technologies can be deployed in order to fill that drop in zero carbon generation? There are opportunities with carbon capture sequestration, but advanced nuclear could have a significant role in the 2030 plus timeframe. Many developments happening worldwide looking at advanced nuclear, high temperature gas, which again starts moving into that low carbon resource initiative area where you have high temperature nuclear reactors supporting electrolysis to produce hydrogen. So advanced nuclear has a big role to play, but the real picture is having a long-term plan that's actually backed by a strategy to get there, not arriving at 2030, 2040 with a significant reduction, then all of a sudden some of those technologies start falling off the table because the long-term strategy, long-term plan wasn't there. And then the other side to this, which we've touched on gently, is the workforce and supply chain issues that need to be worked with in parallel with the technology development. Where does the workforce come from for all this work that needs to be done in the next decades to get to net zero by mid-century? Big challenge for the entire industry.
Now, Neil, given something that you mentioned earlier, what's an example of a realistic integrated generation complex that can provide reliable and resilient electricity to a given community?
Thank you for that. That's a great question. I was looking at a proposed project in the UK the other day. Something Rob mentioned, I'm what I term a recovering nuke. I spent most of my career in nuclear, so it still has a kind of a special place in my heart. So I was looking at a project in the UK for Sizewell C, and I, many years ago, was involved in the startup of Sizewell B. And the proposal for Sizewell C is to build 2 Gen 3 nuclear reactors, and actually for them to produce hydrogen as part of their economic model, and that hydrogen to be piped to a hydrogen hub in one of the industrial areas in the east of England. Also using power from Sizewell C for direct air capture to actually absorb CO2 direct from the atmosphere and then store the CO2. And the other thing that is being contemplated is, as you may know, the UK has a tremendous footprint of offshore wind. So there's offshore wind turbines near the proposed Sizewell C site. So integrating offshore wind and nuclear into this ecosystem around a hydrogen hub, an industrial hub in the east of the UK is something which is actually being talked about as part of the proposal. And it's only one of many people talking about these hubs to actually co-locate hydrogen generation, baseload generation, and other infrastructure to actually achieve this transformation.
That's great.
And Samantha, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just to build off of what Neil was saying there, I love that particular concept because it is taking a look at kind of the central generation concept, leveraging those sites, and then with hydrogen or other low carbon carriers advancing, maximizing the asset utilization. We also have the chance on a smaller scale. When I think about community resilience, that there are smaller scale opportunities out there that I think are going to be highlighted maybe through the Biden infrastructure plan going forward, that really begins to look at community solar storage and the ability to develop resiliency strategies that might be much more focused on a isolated or islanded community, and including what many folks are talking about in terms of taking advantage of the flexibility of electrification of end use and being able to leverage that as a resource going forward. So I love that Neil kind of gave the scale, the size of a particular opportunity at scale. And then the flip of that is that there is this opportunity on a smaller scale to think about communities and taking advantage of electrification of end use, renewables, storage, and developing resiliency and reliability strategies, focus more a little bit on microgrids, I guess, going forward. So I see the spectrum of opportunities, which is really exciting.
Yeah, and some of the things we haven't talked about in great detail is the research needs alongside some of these technologies. Wind technology exists, offshore wind technology is being developed, but there's things which have recently fallen out of favor and need to come back onto the table in the next few decades. Carbon capture, utilization, sequestration. That is going to be key if we're going to get there. Direct air capture of carbon. It's actually not a lot of point if you've got nowhere to put the CO2. If we can figure out carbon capture sequestration, then gas has a role, at least in the transition, maybe longer term. Coal could have a role as well. So we need to move some investments and focus onto technologies like carbon capture sequestration as well. And there's other things that need to be looked at, which have been touched on before, maybe fallen off the table. We need to bring all these technologies back into play.
Rob, I want to get back to a point you made earlier around electrification and the role that electric vehicles have to play in decarbonization of the transportation sector. What is the next big hurdle in order for this to become a reality?
Yeah, and I'm going to build a little bit off of what Neil was just talking about. So let me say from an engineering perspective, we always talk about technical potential, and then we talk about economic viability, and then we go into achieve it, what is actually achievable. So when we look at from a transportation perspective on the technical side of the house, and right now I'm going to look at the light duty side. I'll make a comment about fleet in just a moment. But on the light duty side, we are at that point where it is now technically viable. I mean, battery storage, the inroads that have been made with battery storage have been significant. The technology has been proven within the auto industry, and you're beginning to see that ranges are increasing significantly. So we have, from a technical perspective, reached that point within the OEM industry where electric vehicles are going to be able to be more front and center in terms of a tried and true technology. On the economic front, we also know that battery costs are driving down the overall production costs, and that we expect price parity between an electric vehicle and an internal combustion engine really in the next, I would say, 2 to 3 years. Some will say a little later than that. Some will say a little sooner than that. But when you look at that, and you now have technical aspects, and you have the economic viability, then from a market perspective, what's going to really make a difference for consumers is, one, do they have the model available for them that they are interested in? And the reality is that in the U.S., 66% of the vehicles purchased are focused on either an SUV or a light-duty pickup. So until those technologies become available, those models become available, I think there's still going to be a gap in terms of consumers wanting to adopt the technology and make that change. But we see that coming also with Rivian and GM and Ford. All of them are getting very focused in the SUV market and in the small pickup market. So we believe the models are going to be there. The next step is going to be the infrastructure. And the Biden administration is proposing potentially as part of their infrastructure bill, including or expanding the charging network in the U.S., which is about 100,000 chargers to more than 500,000 chargers. So significant infrastructure investments to support that so folks can get rid of the range anxiety. So that's on the light duty side. If I look at the fleet side, we actually see at a really exciting time in the fleet side of the house, mainly because what you have is large companies like Amazon, like PepsiCo, like UPS, like FedEx, are making sustainability commitments as a corporation. And a big part of their carbon footprint is associated with the transport of their goods, whether that be last mile delivery, like Amazon's model or UPS, or whether it be the longer haul that sometimes PepsiCo does, and having to include the heavy duty vehicles. But what we see right there on the fleet side is a commitment to electrify by our industry partners. And what they are looking for, of course, then is the utilities to make sure that they are prepared to scale in a timely and economic manner. And let me just say really quickly, when I say this, right now there are several demonstrations going on within the U.S., several dozen demonstrations around fleet electrification in the U.S., but ultimately we're looking at thousands of sites coming forward to say we want to be able to electrify that site. These sites require megawatts worth of power. It's not a small amount of power that a utility typically might just have available in their back pocket. So it's going to require some optimization tools around utility planning and around fleet operator planning, and to make sure that we can maximize their investment, because ultimately it does come down to affordability. Fleets are going to transition based upon affordability. They want the sustainability objective, but affordability needs to stay front and center. So I'm going to just suggest that utilities have a real opportunity to enable the scaling of fleets by making sure that our infrastructure is available when the fleets are ready to go. And then on the light duty side, the 500,000 plus chargers, the fact that the OEMs are developing models that consumers want, I think we're going to be ready to hit mainstream here very shortly.
So there's a lot needs to be done. Huge amount needs to be done. And, you know, not every organization is going to be able to figure this out. EPRI by itself is not going to be able to do all of this. There's going to be an incredible need for collaboration of people coming together. Yeah, I'll tell you, look at hydrogen. Japan is doing tremendous amount on hydrogen. Europe is doing tremendous amount on hydrogen. The US, frankly, is trying to catch up with hydrogen. So we're looking to bring people together to learn those lessons, to collaborate, because even a big utility can't do this, can't learn all the things together. So there's a huge amount to be done, not much time to do it in, and the real collaboration between all these people is going to be the sweet spot. And Rob's quite right. All the things need to be done on charging and infrastructure. It needs to be done in a coordinated way. So there's a tremendous amount that needs to be done in a relatively short period of time.
And Neil, I'm glad that you mentioned collaboration because I want to give just a quick mention of EPRI's Electrification Forum series coming up, because we have a 4-day event around the electrification of transportation, e-mobility, June 7th through the 10th. If you're interested in that, electrification2021.com. You'll see a lot more information about that and opportunity to collaborate with other industry stakeholders. So as we close out, Neil and Rob, one last question for you. How urgent is it for the global industry to adopt these decarbonization strategies?
That is such a good question. I was reflecting on this very issue earlier today. When I was a young submarine engineer, I remember being involved in changing the chilled water plants on my submarine in response to the climate effects of the refrigerant being used. So that was several decades ago. The discussion on climate change was already going on. And the industry, be it the electricity industry, the global industry around the electricity industry, has been, I'll say, nibbling away at the issue of climate change for 30 plus years. And as I look at it, coming out of the pandemic and all the discussions that have gone on the last 12 to 18 months, I'm seeing this big realization that the Glasgow climate meeting in October is going to be a key moment where people are really talking about coming together to address climate change, decarbonization. And we keep kicking the can down the road and not getting to it. And what we have now is a big hill to climb. It is technologically possible. It is feasible to deal with all that infrastructure. But there's challenges now about doing an affordable way, an equitable way, and getting there in the right way. So I would say, you know, the time has come for what I characterize as the moonshot to actually get to 2050. We can no longer kick that can down the road which is what I have seen throughout my entire career, be it in the electric industry, the defense industry, of realization there was an issue out there that need to be dealt with, but not really grasping it and getting on with it.
Yeah, and Samantha, just to build on what Neil said, there is a real sense of urgency in the industry right now. And when I say industry, once again, I want to reinforce that it's a global economy-wide decarbonization objective that we have to address. It isn't a objective just for the electricity sector or the transportation sector. It is a global approach to figuring out how we decarbonize our economy going forward. And I want to highlight a couple of things there really quickly because I think it's important, especially as we set the stage for Earth Week going forward. Equity is going to be a key part of this. The fact is we cannot leave anyone behind in this energy transition that is going on. And by that, I mean that either their reliability, their resiliency, or their affordability is affected. At the end of the day, we need to make sure that no matter what socioeconomic groups are impacted, and they need to be part of the solution, and they're brought along for as part of that solution going forward. I think the other thing to really emphasize is when we think about decarbonization, it's a key element of sustainability in general. Environmental is the E of an ESG. The S is societal, and that's the equity piece, and then the governance piece. There's this notion that we focus in on the environmental piece, and like I said, we need to maintain the equity piece, but the key differentiator here is going to be around innovation. It is going to be around accelerating innovation and creating or reacting to that sense of urgency that Neil just mentioned. And in accelerating innovation, what we have to look at is what we can do as the electricity sector, but then also what do we do within transport, buildings, and industry to make sure that we're enabling decarbonization for those sectors. And once again, from an affordability perspective, a reliability perspective, and then a resiliency perspective, and making sure that all folks are brought along. So I would almost say that our challenge globally is around innovation and R&D, and how now that, as Neil said, we kicked the can down the road, now we have to say we have a short period of time that we need to react upon and invent and innovate within and make sure that we're prepared to go to market. And Neil touched on some of the technologies earlier, whether it be advanced nuclear or CCS, the low carbon carriers. It is just going to be an interesting time within the industry that forces get rallied together to figure out how we address this globally. And it is a global challenge.
Yeah, so Rob, as we round this out, I've got this reputation for Winston Churchill quotes. So this feels like an incredible challenge, and it's pretty daunting. But I would argue now is the time for us to really grasp that challenge and meet it. And the quote is, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. And now is the time for us to really understand that we've got 20 years to address this issue. It's possible, a lot of work to be done, and we can get there by collaborating together. So thank you, Samantha.
Yeah,
thank you. I want to thank
Samantha, just one point for Neil, because Neil mentioned it earlier, supply chain, workforce, there's other factors beyond just the innovation of technology that need to be taken into consideration. Completely agree with you, Neil. That we have the opportunity as an industry to advance this forward. Samantha, let me turn it back to you.
I want to thank both Neil and Rob for participating in our Pathways to Decarbonization discussion today. And I want to thank everybody out there for joining today. I also want to remind you to tune in for the other 5 sessions we have this week in celebration of Earth Week. Tomorrow we have 2 sessions. We're kicking it off with nuclear's role in a clean energy future, followed by electrification for a net zero world. Wednesday and Thursday, we have sessions focused on our low carbon resource initiative. And Friday, we finish out the week with a session on decarbonization, sustainability, and equity. Again, thank you and enjoy the rest of your Earth Week.